Okay, so today we're interviewing Dr. Oliver Heydorn on how he came to Douglas Social Credit, how he heard about it, how he found it, and how he came to understand and realize that it is the answer to the modern economic and financial crisis that is affecting the world. Problems with the financial system, the monetary system, and the banking system, and the grave inequity that is affecting mankind because of these systemic problems in the financial economic system. So, Dr. Heydorn, how did you hear about, first of all, how did you first hear about Douglas Social Credit?
Well, before I tell that story, I might go a bit further back and explain that even as a child, let's say 10 years of age and into my early teenage years, I always had sort of the impression that there was something seriously wrong with the financial system, something seriously wrong with the economic order. And it just seemed to me that it was irrational. You know, my father had a very good job. He was a professor of psychology at a community college. My mother didn't work outside the home, so she wouldn't have had an income. But even with my father's very good paying job, it was often the case that there were things that we couldn't afford. There always seemed to be insufficient money, insufficient income in my father's pocket, sort of to meet the prices that were on offer for whatever it is. And I'm not talking about anything super luxurious, but just normal things that people would buy or you know, things that people would want to do, families would want to do, go on vacation or things like this. And so there was always this sort of monetary stringency. There was never enough. And later on, then I went to university and I did get some scholarships, but they weren't enough to cover tuition and other expenses, so I ended up going into debt. And I think by the time I had finished my master's degree, I was about $25,000 in debt. So this is something that I had acquired probably over 7 or 8 years. And in 2002, I came home for the summer. I was studying in Liechtenstein at the time, and I came home to stay with my parents in Ontario for the summer months. And one day, a leaflet was dropped in our mailbox. This leaflet was one of the circulars from the Pilgrims of St. Michael. There is this Catholic organization called the Pilgrims of St. Michael, Les Pèlerins de Saint-Michel, which is based in Quebec, which has been promoting Douglas Social Credit for a number of decades. So periodically they will drop off pamphlets in various locales. And so I was interested in, of course, I had a general interest in economics and the money problem. And I read it and I thought, oh, you know, what they're saying makes a great deal of sense. But initially, the thing that shocked me was the fact that banks actually create the vast majority of our money supply, and they create it out of nothing, right? So contrary to what most people, even today, tend to believe, coins and bills are a very small percentage of the money supply. Most of the money supply exists in the form of intangible numbers, abstractions, really, in the form of bank credit. And whenever banks make loans or they make purchases, they create this money. And whenever those loans are paid back or their, let's say, securities are sold, the money is destroyed. So it was really shocking to me to learn that most of the money supply is created ex nihilo, for all intents and purposes, simply by the bank's decision to make a purchase or make a loan.
Mm-hmm.
And because, of course, when you go to a bank and you get a loan, they don't tell you. I mean, there's no informed consent. No one sits you down and says, you do understand that this loan we're giving you is not someone else's money that we're now, on lending to you. You do understand that we actually create the money that we lend. They're not upfront about that.
No.
Um, and so most people, even today, if they get loans of various sorts, they think the bank is lending them pre-existing money that they obtain from somewhere, whether it's from the government or from other depositors. So I was shocked about this fact, and
Yeah.
I was, I guess I was um, about 27 at the time, and I was $25,000 in debt, and I had no prospect of a job on the horizon, so I didn't know how I was going to even pay off any of this debt.
Okay.
And I thought to myself, okay, so this money that they've lent, they've created out of nothing, right? I've borrowed $25,000 from two different banks in total to meet tuition and other expenses. And they've created this out of nothing. And if I pay them back the way they want to be paid back over the time frame, I was going to end up having to pay them something like $8,000 in interest.
Oh
Right,
my
so
goodness.
yeah, so you have to pay back the principal, which is 25,000, plus an additional 8,000, which
Mm.
is proportionally nothing compared with what people pay on mortgages, but nevertheless, for someone who doesn't have a job and doesn't have a prospect of a job, these sorts of financial
Yep.
conditions become very oppressive.
I
And
can imagine.
I thought to myself, well, they haven't done $8,000 worth of work for me. Like, it didn't seem fair if you consider that as an isolated operation, creating this money, this $25,000, actually costs them nothing. And the actual creation of it costs them nothing. And then of course they've got administrative costs, but there didn't seem to be any linear connection between the costs they would incur to provide this service and $8,000. If I pay someone to put in a pool, maybe I pay them $9,000 for raw materials, labor, etc., and then I give them, if we're talking about a very generous situation here, I give them another
Yeah.
$1,000 as profit, right?
Yes.
Which is a bit more than 10% profit. That you can live with that, but when you
Yes.
consider having to pay $8,000 in interest alone, and you look at well, how much work was actually involved in this, it seemed to me quite unfair that quite exploitative, really, that I would have to pay so much for money that they are just, it's abstract numbers that they create out of nothing. Now,
Yes.
before we go any further, I have to explain, of course, that social credit is focused on a problem that is far deeper and more profound than the question of usury or economic rent taking in the case of banking, right?
Yeah.
Economic rent in the money markets, in creating and lending bank credit, is a problem. It is a feature of the existing system. But it is not the main problem that Douglas identified or that he's trying to correct. So we need to make that clear. But it was sort of the initial thing that got me interested. It seemed, as I said, seemed dishonest, it seemed fraudulent. They're not really lending you other people's money the way everyone seems to assume. And then, of course, they want to
Mm-hmm.
be paid back all this money on top of it, which is money I don't have because I don't have a job. And so it was that burden weighed on me very heavily. Um, but also, just there were so many times when I wanted to do things, very simple things, like maybe study German at Freiburg
Mm.
University over, for a
Yes.
month or something, and I couldn't do it. Well, it was only about $500, but I couldn't do it because I didn't have the money, right?
Didn't have the
Didn't
money.
have the money.
Yeah.
So, and I should mention, just to sort of further complicate matters too, I should mention that even when I was doing my bachelor's degree in biology, um, before I started the master's. I I had a very Spartan life. I did get some scholarship money, and I was actually working part-time. I had a part-time job, so I was trying to earn money, but of course, working a minimum wage at a fast food restaurant, that
Yes.
money doesn't accumulate very fast. And if
Oh,
I don't remember a single year when it would have paid a full year's tuition, even. All it does is sort of
oh my God.
lessen the amount of money that you would have to borrow, basically.
So that doesn't even pay the principal, it just, let alone the interest.
Oh, well, this is I was talking about tuition.
Yeah.
So even though I was working and even though I had some scholarships funds, I still had to go into
Yeah.
debt. And
Yeah.
then when I
I
moved
see.
away from home, then of course I had residency fees and I had to cover food and things like that. So I had no choice but to go into debt, right? As
Yeah, I
as many
see.
students do. My father didn't have the money to assist with any of
Yeah.
those expenses. So um, it's very, very difficult, especially when you're very young. I started university at 17, and um, there's a lot of changes still going on at that time in your life, psychologically, emotionally, and so forth.
Yes.
And you're under a tremendous amount of stress in university. It's very
Yeah.
in Canada. It's quite rigorous, I would say, and in many cases, I would say even unreasonable. Sort of the expectations that are put on young people,
Okay. Yeah.
and then you have to deal with all this financial pressure on top of it. I mean, it's really quite inhumane
Too
and
much.
oh,
It's
it's
inhumane. It's
irrational,
cruel.
cruel. Yes, all those
I
things.
wonder whether it's, for a lot of courses, degrees, whether it's even worth it these days.
Well,
Yeah.
that's an excellent point because it's has been an issue for me too. That you can study all these different things, but what are you going to be able to do afterwards as in terms of an occupation or a job, right? Will you be able
Yeah.
to make a go of it? Um, so it was a sort of a nasty confluence of circumstances. And so I was very angry when I found out that, how the system works and the fact that the banks are creating this money out of nothing. And yes, so it was this pamphlet from the Pilgrims of St. Michael which sort of blew the lid off of the bank creation of credit.
Mm-hmm.
And from that, then I started to learn more about Douglas social credit and what the real problems are, or I should say the deeper problems, the fact that we say the financial system is not self-liquidating. It doesn't provide sufficient income in the form of wages, salaries,
Yeah.
and dividends to offset all of the costs that are
Yes.
simultaneously being generated in production. And the more I learned about it, the more fascinated I was by Douglas's ideas and by Douglas himself. I mean, I think the man was a genius.
Yes.
And
Yep.
I spent the next couple of years just reading and rereading Douglas's articles and his books and his speeches. And eventually I decided that I was going to attempt to put all his ideas together in a systematic whole, all his economic ideas, and that produced the book Social Credit Economics, right? Which I've got a copy
Yeah.
of that here. So
I
that's the
see.
book that I
Uh,
eventually
so
published in
that's, and what year was that?
2014. So I started writing this in
Yeah.
2008, and took me about 5 years, and then a little bit more to do the editing and that sort of thing. And then it was published in 2014. So 550 pages
Yeah.
and 5
Yes,
years,
that's
five
quite
plus.
expensive.
Yes. um, yeah. So
I think anyone who reads through or takes the time to read through all of that should grasp a pretty good understanding of Douglas social credit.
yes, I think so. It's pretty thorough. So, and
Yeah.
it relies very heavily on the original text. So I'm citing, whenever I make a point, I try to cite Douglas to back up that what I'm saying is in fact
Yeah.
how he understood the matter.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I've published other books on
So,
social credit after that, but that was the first one. So,
yeah.
long story short, I was so struck by this pamphlet that I had received that it has literally changed the course of my life. And
Yeah.
I,
Wow. That's
yeah,
incredible.
thought sort of
Incredible.
it's,
And now you've written 4 or 5 books on it now,
yes, that's right. Yeah.
and
So
traveled all over creation giving talks
that
on
too, that
Douglas
too.
social credit.
And I wouldn't do it
Yeah.
unless I was convinced that substantially, fundamentally, Douglas was onto something, that he's saw something important, and he provided the diagnosis and the remedy, and the world
Yeah.
needs to hear his message because although we've had social credit governments, at least nominal social credit governments in Canada, in Alberta, they held power for 40 odd years, and
Yeah.
in British Columbia. We also had 30 social credit
Yeah.
MPs in the federal parliament in the early 60s. If you were to talk to anybody in Canada today under, I don't know, maybe 60 or 50, and you mentioned social credit or Douglas, they either wouldn't know what you're talking about, or they would assume that you're talking about that Chinese totalitarian monitoring system that has absolutely nothing to do with Douglas social credit.
Yes. So it's
So,
just disappeared down the Orwellian memory hole.
yes, Douglas and his ideas, his economic diagnosis and program for monetary reform have very much been shoved down the Orwellian memory hole. And so part of the work that I've been doing is trying to recover that and to make it
Yeah.
accessible to people so that his message can be heard. And
Yeah.
we,
To try to make it known to the modern audience.
that's right, that's right. Because the problems he identified are still active in the economic system. And in fact, the situation is progressively getting worse because we're becoming more and more indebted, whether it's public debt, commercial debt, or a personal debt. And whenever
Yeah.
that debt becomes so heavy that people can't take on more debt, then the economic system stalls, right? And there's a risk then of a recession, financial crisis, what have you. So
Yeah.
these problems are not um, sort of different from what Douglas was talking about in the 30s and 40s. It's just maybe it's become more complicated. It's certainly become
Yeah.
more entrenched, but
More advanced.
more advanced. But the problems he identified are still awaiting a reasonable, sensible resolution. And we all suffer,
Yes.
whether we recognize it or not, we all suffer from the fact that these problems are not recognized, not properly addressed. And the result is, recurring financial crises, cost push inflation, poverty in the midst of plenty, servility in place of freedom, heavy taxation.
Yeah.
Go down the list: mass migration, environmental problems, trade wars, military war. It's all bound up with the
Lack of leisure time
lack of leisure time. Yeah.
for family and developing one's talents and
Yeah.
uh,
And just as
abilities.
my own life was sort of a witness, just the artificial financial pressure to which so many
Yes.
people are subject, and there's no physical reason for it. It's because our financial system we have in place is not an accurate system, and it doesn't function in an optimal fashion where the common good is concerned.
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's the part where that makes it so sinister and really evil, is the fact that there's no material or physical necessity for this
That's right.
scarcity.
That's
It's all
absolutely right.
artificial. It's all artificially maintained to benefit that of the financial oligarchs and the private banks at the expense
That's right.
of humanity and civilization.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So if we had a financial system that was merely a servant of our physical potential and what we wanted to do with the economy physically, the only limits would be physical limits, right? If we can provide everyone with first-class healthcare physically, that is to say, if we've got the resources, the labor, the raw material, the machinery, etc., to provide everyone with
Yes.
first-class healthcare,
Yep.
then there should be no financial reason why that care is not provided, right? If we've got the means
Yeah.
to fulfill a need, and we've got the need on the other hand, then finance should just sort of be a facilitator and enable us
Yes.
to actualize what we're physically capable of
Yep.
producing.
Of of producing. That's right. So the financial system should really be a facilitator rather than an arbiter.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. One of the sort of the images that I like is if you think of a dog and its tail, and let's say that the dog represents the physical economy, right? So raw material, labor, machinery, etc. And then the tail, on the other hand, is the financial system. Because of the way the present financial system is designed, where it's artificially limiting our productive potential and also artificially limiting our capacity as consumers to liquidate finally production costs. We're in a situation where the financial tail is in control and it's wagging the dog of the physical economy, right? So that's a completely inverted
Yes.
relationship. If the
Yep.
financial system were honest and money were not a commodity, but simply an accounting device, the physical economy and what we wanted to do with it would be able to wag the financial tail as, when, and where required, right?
Yeah.
So one of the axioms in Douglas social credit is that whatever is physically possible and desirable should be financially possible, right? There should be no artificial financial limits on the useful productive capacity.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense.
Mm.
Makes sense to me. It should make sense to just about every reasonable human being.
Right.
That
Right.
that should be the case.
Right. So you have people, of course, who instinctively might, upon hearing that, may react and say, "But where is the money to come from?" Right? You always hear that. But
Yep.
money, as I was explaining earlier, it's just abstract numbers. We can create as much of it as we want, and as long as we keep it in the proper relationship with the physical economy, then there's no danger of, let's say, hyperinflation or things of that nature. Right?
Yeah. That's right. We just create as much money that is needed, or as much money that is that will represent the real production of goods and services.
That's right. That's right. So as long as
Yeah.
we keep that correspondence, keep that
Yep.
relationship one to one, then
Yep.
there's no issue, right? But the point is,
That's right.
we shouldn't be doing without what we actually need to survive and flourish when we have the physical facilities. Either we've got them or we could easily build them in place, right?
Yeah.
So one thing many people don't realize is that many of the production facilities that we possess, factories, the real capital, these factories are not run at 100% of their production capacity. So very often they might be running only at 25% of their capacity or 50%. And the reason that they're not run at a higher rate of usage very often has to do with the fact not that there aren't needs that are going unmet. There are plenty of people that have legitimate needs for clothing, shelter, food, etc. That even
Yeah.
in advanced societies, quote unquote, even in developed economies, there are plenty of people that have those needs. So it's not
Yeah.
because the needs don't exist, but because there's not enough money as buying power in the pockets of those people to act
Yes.
as a demand on the existing productive capacity, so that more of the necessary goods and services would be forthcoming.
Yeah, yeah, that's it. Very well explained. So, Oliver, what would be two things that you find most fascinating and the most impressive about Douglas social credit? Like two particular aspects or
Of it.
solutions.
Well, I was always attracted. I was always attracted to the idea of having a dividend, right?
Yep.
Because if I had a dividend, for example, when I was going through school, I would have a means to pay the tuition, right? I'd have a means to meet other expenses of living. So there would have been a
Yep.
security there, which could only have helped me to concentrate more effectively on my studies.
That's right. Exactly.
So, I
Yep.
mean, there's all sorts of inefficiencies under the present system. I think a lot of people don't realize just how much is wasted in terms of people's time, health, um, talent, because they don't have the financial security necessary to function effectively and efficiently at whatever it is that they're doing, whether they're at school or they have a job or what have you.
Yeah.
So it would have made a huge difference to me as a student had I had it from so many points of view.
Yes. For
And
sure.
also, I thought that the dividend was attractive because it does provide for the possibility of leisure. We don't have to have a policy of full employment under Douglas social credit, right? If we have reached such a stage of advanced technology that we can provide all the goods and services that people can reasonably require
Mm-hmm.
to survive and
Yep.
flourish, with only a minority and a diminishing minority at that of the working population actually laboring in the economy, then
Yep.
we can jettison the policy of full employment, and the people that aren't
Yep.
working in the formal economy would still, through the dividend, still retain access to goods and services. So,
Yep.
by temperament, I've always been sort of a thinker, someone who wants to reflect on what we're doing and why we're doing it and things like this.
Yes.
And it was very attractive, the dividend, because it would, for someone like me, or for artists or people with similar temperaments, it would enable them to follow their interests, follow their heart's passion, um, to some significant extent, without having to worry about artificial financial limitations.
Yes.
And it's been
Yeah.
said, for example, that a large number of our inventions were created not by people who had to work 9 to 5 every day, but rather people who
That's right.
had leisure time. They had time to tinker
That's
and
right.
to reflect and to create and to
Exactly.
improve
Yeah.
things. And so I think there's a tremendous amount of creativity and societal potential and personal potential, which is also actually being shipwrecked or undermined by the present full employment rat race economic treadmill system that we have.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
that's such a
So it's
loss to the wider society that it must be incalculable.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's just it stifles innovation.
Mm.
It stifles the creative impulse and even the very fabric and life of society.
Mm.
By the suppression of family life, the forcing of both parents to go out into the workforce, and the placing of children into third-party care providers. So it really it saps and destroys the very life of civilization.
Yes, yes. So it undermines culture. Apart from the creation of let's say beautiful buildings or music or architecture, what have you, I think it also impedes the appreciation of those things, because people
Yes.
that are debt slaves and wage slaves, who are not afforded sufficient leisure time and are under all sorts of artificial financial pressures, don't have the presence of mind or the time or the opportunity or even just the sort of the relaxation to develop an appreciation for folk culture or high culture.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
And of course, nature abhors a vacuum, so something's got to take the place of
Oh, that's
those
right.
organic cultural forms. And what does is often vacuous and or subversive or destructive or ugly.
Yes.
So
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, but
so they say things like drugs or pornography or alcoholism,
or dare I say, musical forms like rap.
yes.
Which I personally don't have an appreciation for. But
no, well, I think that sort of music is born out of a society that's just been crushed by the financial system and the servile worker
Yes, I was about to say that very often the cultural forms we have, visual forms or music forms, they seem to take on the expression of sort of the existential dissatisfaction and angst and confusion of the common people. And that's why they're popular, because they resonate with people's experience. Right?
Yes,
and then of course
right.
They also make the artists who produce that stuff also then are making a heck of a lot of money.
It's the expression of the spirit, the particular spirit and state of being of particular people. That is music, and
that's right.
And they'll create music that reflects their own times, circumstances, and conditions.
That's right. So, if you were to fundamentally alter the financial parameters of civilization and liberate leisure, right, as one of your articles is entitled, then we could expect that a lot of these cultural forms that are less than ideal would sort of tend to atrophy and dissipate, because they wouldn't speak to people's experience anymore.
Yes. Right? Well, that's right. They would have trouble relating to it. It just wouldn't relate to them. It wouldn't be relevant to them.
Not only that, but I think they would see it for what it is.
Yeah.
You see, they'd see how nonsensical or ugly or empty or
product of a troubled, distressed, and ugly time.
That's
and
exactly
circumstance.
Right. That's exactly right. So
yeah.
So now you had asked me something else. I think it was you had asked me about two things that I found most attractive, most interesting.
Yeah.
So that was one of them.
Yeah.
I suppose another thing I could mention, I don't know if it's in my top two things, but it's in my mind now. The other thing I would mention is that there's an elegance to Douglas's solution. The proposal of the national dividend and the compensated price to bring the financial system back into a condition of self-liquidation, which, apart from its functional perfection, has a sort of aesthetic appeal for me. It's an elegant way of restoring functionality to the economic order, and I find it it's like a brilliant insight that you can just sit back and admire and stand in awe of, while wondering, for example, why isn't such an obvious solution applied? And we insist instead on, mounting debt and the compounding interest on that debt. It doesn't make any sense. Because I have a background in biology, this whole idea of self-liquidation, providing enough cost-liquidating purchasing power to offset costs and prices, it also reminded me of the notion of homeostasis in biology, right? So organisms by their nature try to maintain certain very narrow, stable conditions, because it's only within those conditions that all the metabolic processes, for example, that keeps an organism alive, it's only under those conditions that these processes can actually be carried out effectively and efficiently. And a key notion in homeostasis is balance.
Yeah.
And when an organism loses its homeostasis, it loses that balance, then you have all sorts of disease and dysfunction, and if it gets stretched too far, well, death. And so we can make a direct parallel between what happens in the biological world with the financial system and say, if it's not inherently balanced, if it doesn't have this homeostasis where we are being paid enough in the form of income to buy everything we produce without having to rely on additional debt. If we don't have that, and we've got an imbalance between costs and prices on the one hand and incomes on the other, then this imbalance is only going to create other forms of dysfunction, sort of like the pebble that's thrown in the pond and you have the ripple effect, right? And that's basically what's happened because of this fundamental imbalance and our flawed ways of trying to fix it. It throws so many other things out of balance in people's personal lives, social life, cultural life, international relations. Everything sort of is under artificial stress and strain or is being misdirected. And the civilization that we live in, which is falling apart in so many ways, is the result of ignoring Douglas for the last 80 years.
Yeah. Yes. So, that's right. Exactly. C.H. Douglas has offered a solution, or he has the medicine to cure the world of its
ill,
fatal sickness.
That's right.
The world has yet to accept it,
or even to hear of it.
That too. Yes. So that it may be put back in a state of balance and harmony, so that the world may live, or humanity may live again.
That's very well said. Very well said.
Yeah.
And that, of course, is what we're trying to do, our little part to spread that message and make sure that, at the very least, people get the opportunity to hear what Douglas had to say. As the necessary step before we actually can fix any of these problems in an effective and efficient and fair manner.
Yes, no, that's exactly right. Couldn't argue with that. Well, I suppose if thank you very much, Dr. Heydorn. It's so very well explained. Fascinating story of how you came to find Douglas Social Credit.
Oh, you're welcome.
All the excellent work that you've undertaken for its very noble cause.
Thank you.
And continue the good fight until such a time as it may the world may finally take its medicine.
Right. Sounds like
Sounds
like a plan to me, my friend.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, likewise.
So we'll.
All right. So I suppose we'll wrap it up there.
Okay. And.
And we'll catch all of you again in our next installment.
That's it. Thank you.